Welcome to City Club of Portland's Friday Forum. I'm KAROL COLLYMORE, Board Governor for City Club. For 100 years, City Club of Portland is where civic-minded people come together to make Portland and Oregon a better place for everyone to live, work, and explore. We're gathered at the Sentinel Hotel, along with all of you listening on OPB or viewing on Portland Community Media or YouTube. The generous support of City Club's corporate and media partners enables us to put on the state's best civic programs week after week. Our media partner is Oregon Business Magazine, and our current Friday Forum sponsors are Bank of the Cascades, Stoll Reeves, Family Care Health, Russell Fellows Properties, and The Standard. We'd also like to thank our new sponsor, Winning Mark. Please show our appreciation for all of them. Social media. It's quick, it's sexy, it's accessible, and it's opinionated. We know it has changed how we keep up with events and communicate with others. But in the context of polarizing political issues like marriage equality and climate change, has social media actually influenced the way we think? And when it comes to elections, are today's new media tools powerful enough to change how we vote and who we vote for? Joining us today are Simon Tam, Marketing Director for Oregon Environmental Council, and according to Bloomberg Magazine, a social media rock star. Amy Ruiz is Senior Director of Public Policy and Communications at Strategies 360. She previously worked for the Oregon United for Marriage campaign and for Portland's first tweeting mayor, Sam Adams. Lindsay Bershauer is President and Political Consultant for Leona Consulting Company. Moderating today is award-winning reporter Lisa Loving, currently Evening News Director for KBOO Community Radio. Before we get to our panel, Zach Hyder, Partner and Chief Creative Officer for Quinn Thomas, will share insight from a recent study he conducted with DHM Research on social media's influence on public discourse. Please welcome Zach and our guests to City Club.
Thank you, KAROL, and a very big thank you to City Club for having us here to talk about a topic that we've been working on for the better part of a couple years now. Some of you here may have seen that last year Nicholas Carr wrote an article that was published in Political Magazine that made a pretty bold claim. And just summarizing it in a headline, he said, "Social media is ruining politics." Now, within a couple days, all of us around our office had seen a lot of other headlines and articles and studies that seemed to both support and contradict what Carr's essential narrative thesis was. We saw everything from articles that talked about the ineffectiveness of us advocating for marriage equality on our Facebook profiles, to new studies that talked about the unique value that social media has for minority populations trying to draw attention to discrimination. And I think that for most of us here, it does get very tempting to think about this debate by looking at the two polar positions. So there's one school of thought that says using social media for civic engagement is good for us because it opens up the halls of democracy, it provides greater accountability, and it creates spaces where more of our voices can be heard on issues that impact our state and our communities. But then on the other hand, there are those that will say social media is harmful or even destructive in our public discourse because it elevates opinion, rumor, and emotion over facts and critical thought. It creates information silos that allows us to simply ignore the perspectives that we disagree with. And it moves so quickly that it weakens journalistic integrity. So who's right? That is not an easy question to answer, and it is precisely why we felt that it was an important topic for us to explore. So I think all of us here today can probably anecdotally point to things that we feel easily provide some evidence that prove or disprove social media's effectiveness in our political process, whether they're election results or advocacy campaigns that we've seen, or even the latest apology that somebody's forced to give because they tweeted something that somebody found offensive. Although, I got to be honest, even in this, that particular rule, this election cycle, those rules seem to have changed. But this is where a lot of our discussions about this issue will begin and end. We are great at pointing to the outcomes that suggest influence, but we're not as good at providing evidence that clearly links those outcomes to actual social media behaviors. And I liken it sometimes to the explosive rise in gym memberships in the United States over the last couple decades. If you went by the adoption rates alone, why do we have an equally accelerating rate of obesity nationally? It is because adoption and usage, whether it's technology or gym memberships, does not prove effectiveness. So I want to just share a few things from the report that we published in which we essentially tested KAR's central thesis, but we tried to localize it here to Oregon. So first, does social media activity actually shape public opinion? Well, 58% of Oregonians said that what they see on social media does, in fact, have a lot or some impact on their support for public policy here in the Pacific Northwest. Yet 62% of Oregon social media users said that all the shares, likes, posts, and other activity that they see in their personal social networks has never once changed their opinion in a political debate. What is the public's perception about social media's value? Is it perceived as an echo chamber that simply allows us to reinforce our own viewpoints, or is it actually a space for thoughtful civic debate? 58% of the people we polled said it only validates our existing views on important issues. And in fact, 67% said, I actively censor my real political views and opinions when I engage on social media. Now, interestingly, we also found that more than half said that social media has as much or more impact in bringing about needed changes here in Oregon as would voting. Think about that for a second. That is a pretty bold statement. It has as much or more influence than voting. And this was a trend that was consistent across other civic behaviors such as volunteering and donating to a cause or a nonprofit. So if we step back away from the data for a second, I think it's really important that we all remember we are only at the very beginning of what really is a new era of shared media. If we think about the genesis of social media's rise, we are not even a full decade into what many hail as a revolution in how we communicate. So we should all be mindful that we don't yet fully understand how it influences how we make decisions as a society, and therefore should be careful to avoid trying to draw definitive conclusions as quickly as we can like somebody's recent posts. If we accept that as the foundation for having a truly thoughtful conversation about social media's influence, we are able to explore the more interesting areas of how this revolution is impacting the state of our political progress here in Oregon. With that said, I hand it over to you, Lisa, and our panel to tease that out further. Thank you.
Thank you, Zach. If you're just tuning in on OPB, you're listening to the City Club of Portland's Friday Forum. I'm Lisa Loving, the news director at KBOO Community Radio. I'm here with Simon Tam, marketing director for the Oregon Environmental Council, Amy Ruiz, who was the communications director for Oregon's marriage equality campaigns, and Lindsay Berschauer, a Republican political consultant. We're talking about social media's influence on elections. I wanted to start by reading a quote that was at the top of Zach's awesome report that really frames, I think, this whole discussion. This is probably the most important thing for everyone to keep in mind as you walk away. Understanding the nuances of the social media news environment is complicated. The experience is individualized through one's own choices, through the friends in one's network and their proclivities, and through algorithms, all of which can change over time. We're only beginning to understand these complex interactions. And a woman named Amy Mitchell, who's the director of journalism research at the Pew Charitable Trust, said that last year. So I wanted to start out, who read the study? I'm just kidding. It's wonderful, though. If you get the chance, you absolutely should. It's fascinating. This study looks primarily at Facebook, and it finds most people in the Northwest who post political content on their Facebook are liberal, okay? So, right? So how do you reach independent and conservative voters? Where are they? Do you worry about that?
They all look at me.
No, I think everyone should answer that, though.
Well, I have a slightly different experience. A lot of my followers and folks on social media are conservative. They create groups. They try and stay connected that way. So it's definitely there. Whether or not their tendencies are more political or not political is obviously something that's still being studied. But I have been effectively able to stir the conservative grassroots many times on social media. So,
Great.
I would say it really depends on what issue you're trying to communicate about. When I worked on the marriage equality campaign, we couldn't rely just on a message on social media reaching every person in Oregon we were trying to reach. We had to first build the right audience on social media, and a lot of times that takes work that happens offline. That campaign in particular had a specific branch focused on outreach to conservatives and Republicans in Oregon. We knew we had to do the offline organizing to be able to build the broad movement that cut across ideology to win statewide.
Yeah, and I think it's also important to consider that whether something's posted only on Facebook or not, it does have a dramatic effect in other channels. So when you think about how news articles are being written about what's being talked about on social media now, it has a fascinating effect on a much broader media landscape. The other part to consider is that Facebook users, Twitter users, and social media users are not exclusively consumers of the media, but they're also producers of it as well. So as long as we're only looking at social media channels as a way to amplify a particular message, that really defeats the purpose of social media. But if we use it as a tool to engage in conversations, then we're really developing those communities where we can have these important conversations about policy, about issues that are facing our communities.
I want to bowling ball roll the new motor voter law through this conversation, because I was reading some numbers this morning that show that, I hope I have it right, more than 15,000 people now are new registered voters in the state that had never voted before, and it's a mosaic of people. They're up for grabs. It's like that kind of tip-off at the beginning of a basketball game. How are you going to reach those people as campaigners, environmentalist campaigns, elected official campaigns? How are you going to reach them? And do you see social media as a way to do that? Because this is a big number moving forward, by the way. This is the headwaters of a river, right?
Sure. I mean, for me and our work at the Oregon Environmental Council, I believe that we need to utilize every tool possible, social media being one of the many tools available in that mix to reach individuals. I think it's interesting that a lot of times we assume who's on social media. We're thinking, oh, it's millennials, it's younger folks. But the two fastest groups on social media are seniors, both on Facebook and on Twitter. And if we recognize that there's a whole diverse array of audiences on there, we need to cater our messaging appropriate to those audiences if we truly want to reach them. There's no one size fits all. And the wonderful thing about social media is that you can measure, monitor, and modify your message in real time. So it allows us to be more effective. We can segment our audiences, see what's more effective, and use that to roll into other forms of media as well.
I think one thing people who don't do this kind of work day to day may not realize, but there's a back end to Facebook where you can do some pretty exciting things like get a database of registered voters and match it with people who are on Facebook and target your messaging to people who are registered to vote. So if you're spending money on pushing your messaging, you're not spending money on people who are not going to get a ballot. They may see it still when the friends share it, but you really do want to target it to people who are registered to vote if you're trying to move an election. As to the new motor voter folks, though, I don't think we know if that group is going to be in any way, shape, or form different than people who, self-selected into registering to vote. I think we'll have to study that during the primary and more importantly in November when we have a bigger group of people to look at. I think for now, most folks who are taking this into account are just operating under the assumption that we're going to treat them like any other voter.
Yeah, I don't know that motor voter gives us a roadmap for people on social media. I think people who have been registered to vote for decades, choose not to engage politically on social media. So I'm not sure, and we're still trying to figure out who those people are, frankly, the motor voter folks. But I would agree with my fellow panelists and just say, a lot of it depends on where they're located to, geographically, where are these new voters coming in, and what percentage of them have chosen a party versus just chosen to stay non-affiliated. So.
One major facet of research like this is the conundrum of slacktivism. I was talking with Zach about this issue yesterday, and he's saying it needs more research. But slacktivism, the little bit of research that's been done shows that the more people post stuff on their Facebook, the less they do in the real world, right? So what's your take on that? I mean, does that limit your options? I know that we're talking about Facebook and it seems kind of limited in a lot of ways, but this is it's a thermometer for the future of how people are going to use these platforms. So what do you think? Does it limit your options? Or
When I read that, it terrifies me. Our job really, I mean, at the end of the day, if people aren't voting, if people aren't showing up to a hearing and testifying, if people aren't writing to their legislators, and so utilizing some of the more traditional channels to have their voice heard, their voice may not be heard because social media is so big and so vast, and a single voice can really get diluted there. So, and I know how hard it is to turn people out for those things, to turn people out to vote. I mean, entire campaign operations are focused on getting out the vote. And if so again, just reading that, my jaw dropped a little on, God, maybe we shouldn't even be on Facebook if it's going to demotivate people, because we really do need people to go talk to their neighbors, go knock on the doors, go vote.
What I consider as slackers, I'm not sure that's quite the term. I think that a lot of us that do this work do it begrudgingly some days, especially when your grandparents tell you that everything you post nobody really pays attention to anyway. So, which was what I learned last weekend. But it is exhausting. And Rebecca talked about this a little bit when we were preparing for this forum. How sometimes you have to spend half your day responding to certain things that come up. But I do think it's an effective tool. I have noticed just in this past session that, and we all know who the folks are that sort of become the information leaders on Facebook, the people that post significantly and often, and they sort of rise to the top in terms of folks that are relied upon as a means to disseminate information as to what's going on. That certainly happened in the last session. The radio viewers can't see this, but I brought a copy of the Columbian. This was my Facebook post on one of the bills in the session from the CRC, and the media is now having to deal with the impact of social media and just a whole bunch of people, becoming really citizen activists and paying attention to this stuff, and in some ways surpassing the quickness and the readiness of the media too. So it's a powerful tool. It's not going anywhere. Frankly, I think it's one of our great equalizers when it comes to politics and having access to voters with really not a lot of money. So.
And I would just like to echo that as well. I think it's easy to dismiss people's posts on social media as slacktivism, as not being engaged, but oftentimes getting involved through social media, it can be an access point. It can be an entry into discovering values, maybe working through a legislative issue to a point where they might engage later on down the line. But posting things like on a Twitter thread can influence the legislative session. It could influence elected officials, certainly, because that is the new town hall. There's no guarantee that people who show up to a town hall are going to vote either. And so this could just be that initial step and for people to discover their values, find a way to express them, and perhaps connect with others in their community. And as Lindsay mentioned, I think it's important to think about this in terms of accessibility. We know that communities of color are oftentimes forgotten about during the election cycle unless their votes are needed. Yet in the study that Zach's firm produced show that communities of color are more engaged on social media than whites in the Pacific Northwest. So perhaps this is a way to work with and to reach out to disenfranchised audiences and get them involved in that circle so we can perhaps have more comprehensive ways of getting involved in elections later on.
I'm going to jump in and follow up on that about when Zach said there were people who took the survey who said that posting stuff on Facebook was just as important as voting. When I saw that, I freaked out. I completely freaked out. And that's why I had to talk to Zach. Zach, I need to talk, okay? But what Zach said was that when they were having their focus groups, basically, that the people who participated differentiated between basically sort of long-term social change and the results of a campaign. So when I began to understand the point that was made, I just thought that was incredibly fascinating and valid. So one person who participated said something like, oh, did I write it down? I can use my social media to pressure the system to change, and that's bigger than any single election. So do you ever see yourself visualizing the differential between what you're doing in a campaign and the long-term social change that you're hoping for? And Amy, I'd love to ask you about that with the marriage equality work you've done, because there were campaigns, sure, but that was a long run-up to a big piece of social change.
No, that's a really good point. When the Oregon United for Marriage campaign launched in 2012, that was absolutely not the beginning of that work. I mean, I came in at 2012, and the work that Basic Rights Oregon and other groups around the state had been doing had been going on for years. Starting with, losing Measure 36, or not even starting with Measure 36. That was a huge turning point. But then turning into research, figuring out, it was Oregon that pioneered the love and commitment frame that really turned things around nationally on people's opinions of marriage. It was dedicated volunteers going out and talking to people and telling their stories. I personally believe that and many other people like me who've on Facebook just shared pictures of our normal, boring families helped move public opinion. I think in particular with maybe my more conservative family members saw that we're just as boring as everybody else. Why shouldn't we be able to get married? So when the actual campaign launched, it was really more about taking those years and years and years and years and years of conversations and trying to motivate people to turn those into more imminent action. So we're going to have to build even bigger, but we've been laying the groundwork for so many years.
I do have to say, if you're just tuning in on OPB, you're listening to the City Club of Portland's Friday Forum. I'm Lisa Loving, the news director for KBOO Community Radio. I'm here with Simon Tam, the marketing director for Oregon Environmental Council and many other things. Amy RUIZ, communications director for Oregon's marriage equality campaigns, and Lindy Berschauer, Republican political consultant. We're talking about social media's influence on elections. Can I go to you, Lindsay, about that question of long-term change versus organizing a campaign with a limited goal? I mean, do you see that in your work, and do you see that reflected in the social media that you use?
Sure. I think one of the biggest mistakes a candidate can make is to shut off their social media once they get elected or don't get elected and really go silent. I think it is part of a long-term movement in terms of getting your ideas out and really raising awareness of what's going on in Oregon. So I think for the folks like us who work in this field, this is part of our work. And frankly, we don't know it all either. I mean, this is something it's ever evolving. It's always changing. So I find myself constantly being challenged. I have to learn more and more of new things, and that makes it exciting, but it also makes it kind of exhausting to keep up with too. And I know that a lot of people find this exhausting, but it is really a new avenue for information, and it's here to stay. And frankly, it's been integrated into our schools, and it's really having a tremendous impact on education and education access for folks who have historically been excluded from high quality education. So
I also find it as a way to address long-term strategic issues as well. At Oregon Environmental Council, we worked on one particular issue called the Toxic Free Kids Act that took us nearly a decade to pass. It was just years and years of constantly putting that messaging out there, and it was using channels like social media, discovering how children were indirectly or directly impacted by toxic chemicals and toys and things like that, and bringing those stories out that we were really able to shift the narrative around that particular bill and we're thankful that it passed last year with bipartisan support. And it was only through having those discussions and having them outside of our own regular circles that we were able to do that so successfully.
One of the most interesting things about this study, in my opinion, was what it found around racial differences in how people use social media. Okay? So the study found that white people basically did not see Facebook as a source of news of information, right? Something like 65% or something like that basically said, no, I go on there to look at pictures of my grandkids and cat videos. We knew that, right? But among communities of color, people of color, a far greater proportion saw specifically Facebook as a source of information and news. That freaked me out too, Zach, because I work in news, and I know that there's news outlets all over the country that are hanging by the hits they get on Facebook. So if they thought that a lot of people didn't see it as a source of information, me, would kind of have a cow. But when I talked to Zach about it, what he said was, part of what explains that is that for I'll just say white people, they don't go to Facebook for the information, but they find it scattered in their stream, right? So they're still getting the news and information, but they're not specifically going there to look for it. And I started thinking about this wonderful man named James Crittenden. James, I have to talk about you. He's an African-American man from Portland. He now lives in Las Vegas. He spent time incarcerated. He should be running a newspaper or a radio station somewhere right now, but that's not always happens. That's not always what happens when you're African-American in Northeast Portland. But he learned graphic design in the facility and came out, and now is his own grassroots activist person. And he created a page on Facebook called Portland Gone But Not Forgotten. And all it is basically death notices and obituaries of people from the African American community. I go there every day myself. And I know other people do too, which fascinated me. So I wanted to put it to you three. This idea that people of color are basically going to the social media deliberately for information, does that say something about the failure of mass media to actually adequately cover communities of color? What do you think? What's your take on that?
I'm glad you raised that last point, because that's what I was going to say. As a white person, I don't think most white people realize that the mainstream media is by and large owned by and operated by and written by or produced by white people. So it's not a surprise to me, it's a disappointment to me, but it's not a surprise to me that the vast majority of what you see in newspapers and on TV may be more appealing, may be covering more of the stories for other white people, which means that the also fantastic media, for example, the Scanner here, the Observer, the Asian Reporter, doesn't have the reach that the Oregonian does. So I think it's fantastic that there are other tools to allow people to sort of cultivate their own news channels that are telling the stories of their communities. I don't think we can stop there. I think those stories need to be told to the entire city and to the entire community. But I do appreciate that we now have opportunities to elevate voices that haven't always been elevated.
I would have to agree that it definitely is an opportunity to elevate those voices. When the majority of content creators in the media don't reflect the communities that they're supposedly serving, those communities are going to find another way to get that information. And if it's through social media, if it's through communities and leaders that they trust, voices that they know, then I think that's a great opportunity to get involved in that particular conversation, especially when it comes to elections and politics here in Oregon. And the fact of the matter is that the majority of the media sources owned and operated in Oregon do not reflect the communities of color here. And so, of course, we're going to turn to these other sources. And of course, we're going to try and amplify those voices as much as possible. And if social media is that tool to do it, then we're certainly going to take advantage of that and try and do as much as we can.
Would you like to respond?
Well, I think in general, we're all consumers. I guess I don't see this as a racial thing. We're all consumers of media. Therefore, I think we are seeing a necessary change within the Oregonian, within some of the traditional media outlets, to adjust and adapt to that. And thankfully, that's happening. But what that also does is it enables direct engagement with reporters, with investigative journalists, with the people who are actually consuming media on social media or consuming the news. So I think that's a healthy thing. But ultimately, I think this is just it's a new way of life, and it's positive to know that a huge amount of minorities are engaging this way. But I think that ultimately what we're seeing is the large media groups, Oregonian, whatever, adjusting to fit that. So healthy.
All right. To me, this was the part that resonated the most with me. On my Facebook, I've seen groups of retirees practically fist fighting over whether they should support Bernie or Hillary. Like, I cannot believe like the violence and this one thread I saw, like these people were vicious, and I'm like, but you must be connected in some way. Don't you know each other? That's crazy, right? And then after the election's over, are you going to talk to each other? So Zach mentioned that this issue of counseling media users to be less opinionated and reactionary, right? About the things they see on Facebook is actually important, right? But if you're running a campaign, you want a reaction from people. You don't want them to sleep through it. Do you ever gatekeep that? Do you ever sit there and think, no, this is too crazy. It will make my grandmother start screaming at that one guy, on that thread. Do you ever gatekeep that to dial yourself back?
Yes, all the time.
Can you say that again? We may have missed it.
I said, yes, we do all the time. Look, I mean, I guess I would consider myself a consultant who likes to push the limit. And so when you're trying to get people's attention in a very busy world and our attention spans are, a couple seconds, you want to try and push the limit with some of your messages. But I think social media favors and rewards repetition. And so that's really more important, is building a message over time and getting in front of people with that over time.
I know I've spent many years, whether working for an elected official and coaching my colleagues there, or the marriage campaign being a good example of, the communications director in a campaign usually gets a reputation as being the message discipline person, although they usually get different nicknames for that. And that, especially on an issue like marriage, really does, we had a concerted effort to make sure that our staff and our volunteers and our supporters knew that the only way we were going to win this issue is if we brought people along on their journey. And the fastest way to stop somebody's journey is to say they're dumb, or to call them a bigot, or to say something that just shuts them down. But that's an issue campaign. That's different than partisan politics, where I think the gloves come off much faster. But that is certainly, I've drilled that into so many other people's head that it's definitely gone into mine, and I'm over-moderate myself for sure.
I guess I'm a little different, and it also depends on my particular role, but I do not moderate. I welcome that lively discussion. And I actually have this statement where I say, I always read the comments section. And people find it surprising. And I'm like, it reminds me, every time I see vitriolic comments, every time I see hate, it reminds me that there's hurt there in the world, and it forces me to be more compassionate towards those views, because there's a story behind that hate or behind that fear. I can't, even count how many death threats I've received from white supremacist groups in my work in anti-racism, but I've realized that the more that I engage with that audience, and the more that I begin asking questions instead of making questions, more that I ask questions instead of making assumptions about them, the more that I've been able to connect with the humanity of those people. And if we're going to talk about long-term change, you can't change people if you shut them down, if you turn them off. And so I think it's extremely important to be compassionate about that and find ways where you can connect with similar values. And it's difficult, and it's probably not for everybody, but I definitely see it as a pathway to engage in and actually hopefully move forward.
What were you going to say, Amy?
And I want to point out, I think there's a difference, when I say that I overly moderate myself, that doesn't mean I don't say anything. That means that if there's a robust debate between Hillary and Bernie supporters, I may get in there and ask a question in an attempt to get somebody to think a little bit more about what they just said, or maybe explain it in a way that might frankly, in some ways I'm trying to kind of coach it along, like, what were you really trying to say there? Because you're screaming a lot, and I can't quite hear it. So I think there's ways that, and I think that's what I'm hearing Simon say a bit, is I think it's incumbent on all of us, really, to try to help the discourse, both in real life and in online life, get to a level of depth that we're not currently seeing.
I do want to follow up real quickly then. Lightning round, okay? Have you ever had a Facebook emergency, and how did you fix it?
Can you define Facebook emergency?
Someone threatening to hurt you.
I guess I've had many, and I just try and respond by taking a moment before reacting immediately and thinking about why would they say something like that, and how I could reach them in a more compassionate manner.
Okay.
I actually don't think I have. I've certainly had, people post an unflattering photo, and I go and tag myself real fast. But no, honestly, no. But I am I'm so paranoid that I, double, triple, quadruple check which account am I on, what am I saying? Is it, I've had certainly typos that I go back and fix, but no, I'm so overly paranoid. I've been very lucky in that regard.
I would say candidate selfies. They are not good, never good. We usually have to remove the selfies. But I don't know about emergencies. I mean, we've definitely had instances where we would have to go back and correct ourselves, but that's the nature of the forum, and I think that's a healthy thing too. So.
Yeah, and there's also certain safety tools available as well, if there is certainly an emergency. When I used to run digital communications for some of our higher education institutions, if there was a bomb threat, if there's a live shooter situation, we would certainly move into a crisis communications mode. And so I think that's handled a little bit differently than, say, like a personal Facebook page or something like that.
Okay, this is just another quick lightning round. Have you ever had any big Facebook victories? And what do those look like? And how would you define them? You can say no. How do you tell on your Facebook if everything's going well in a campaign?
There's a couple ways for me to answer that one. When the courts in Oregon legalized marriage here, we were ready. We knew that a decision was coming in. We hoped it was going to be the decision we hoped it would be. So we had posts ready to post, and within seconds of reading that decision, we had a victory post up on the Oregon United page. And ironically, that was the most reposted post we'd had in the entire year and a half of the campaign. So on one hand, that was fantastic. It was seen by like 1 million people. It was so exciting to see everybody to repost that and reshare that. But one thing I was reading in the study we're talking about today is that's not uncommon. I don't necessarily consider that a victory, as exciting as it was, because where were those people 3 months earlier when we were looking for people to do phone banks or to go do other more traditional actions? So I think there is a phenomenon as well of people sort of jumping on the bandwagon after the bandwagon's already left.
Slacktivism.
I think victory on social media, I certainly noticed it with the CRC campaign back in 2014. The amount of folks that were able to come together, not only conservative, taxpayer advocate type of groups, but also the bike share folks and some of the environmental groups that came together on social media and really caused a storm against that proposal. I consider that a victory. I mean, these are people that don't necessarily work together very often. But also candidate specific, I think when you get to the point where you realize that your candidate's message is setting the tone of the campaign, that's a victory. When the opponent is having to respond to the messages that you are just relentless about on social media, that's a victory. Doesn't necessarily mean a win, but it is in the context of this forum, I would consider that a victory.
Yeah, and at Oregon Environmental Council, we recently helped pass a bill to transition Oregon out of out-of-state coal, and I would say that was months and months of work and getting people involved with that particular conversation. And I would say that was a victory because we use social media as a primary platform to drive constituents to contact their legislatures and to contact the Senate and House, and we were able to pass that bill with bipartisan support. So, in fact, it's being signed into law right now by Governor Brown as we speak. So that is definitely a victory.
Congratulations. If you're just tuning in on OPB, you're listening to the City Club of Portland's Friday Forum. I'm Lisa Loving, the news director for KBOO Community Radio. I'm here with Simon Tam, the marketing director for the Oregon Environmental Council, Amy Ruiz, who is the communications director for Oregon's Marriage Equality Campaign, and Lindsay Burschauer, a Republican political consultant. We're talking about social media's influence on elections. Let's go now to the audience for some questions. If you've written a question on an index card, hold it high for our dear friends to collect. I'll read at least one. I'm surprised you guys didn't say like your birthday every year is the big victory. I always feel Facebook birthdays are awesome, you know? It's one of the things that's sticky for me on there. Anybody have a question? Oh, there you go. Go ahead.
Hi, my name is Veronica Green. I'm a civic scholar from Native American Youth and Family Center. And based on what you've all seen on social media websites about the presidential debate, do you think it's impacting the way people are voting?
Do you think social media is impacting the presidential debate?
Yes, I think so, in a healthy way, whether we agree with it or not. Like I said, this is just another vehicle to exchange ideas and messages, and regardless of who your candidate is or what you notice about your candidate's followers on social media, I do think it's influencing the debate.
Yes, ma'am.
Hi, I'm Betty Leviton. I'm a City Club member. I have a question for all three of you. You represent three moments in the political spectrum: a single issue, what used to be called special interest area, environmental law, and a political party. Politics in the United States used to be across platforms for a political party. How do you see social media impacting the traditional way in which voters choose who to support in a presidential and local election? And will social media erode completely the impact of political party platforms that come out of conventions in the future? Thank you.
Well, speaking from the nonprofit point of view, we actually don't endorse candidates. We focus primarily on issues. So what we try and do is get Oregonians to vote with their values. And if you care about clean air, water, toxic-free environments, that's what we advocate. And I believe social media enhances that discussion to say, really, let's think about these bills and how they impact our communities. How do these issues disproportionately impact communities of color, low-income communities, and so on? And we use that to kind of amplify the voices that are around, being most affected by issues in the state.
I would say that there are still so many tools that are used in the political world. We've touched on a few here, and social media is one of those. So I think it's important to keep that in context, that it's sort of the bread and butter of defining your issues, figuring out how to best talk about your issues are still important no matter which platform or channel you're using. I think what's different about social media is the opportunity it provides people to leverage their positions. Not everybody has access to a TV ad or to mailing all of their neighbors, but anybody can get online and share their opinion, and if it's a popular opinion, it can take off. I think that's the important thing to keep in mind. We weren't talking about free college tuition a few years ago, and a lot of people are talking about that now. What that's going to mean for a party's platform remains to be seen, but somebody's going to have to talk about it.
I actually think it does erode some of the party labels, and I think that's a healthy thing. On social media, you can get your message out based on the issues that you believe in, and you are not confined by a party label or even, the perception of what the party stands for. I represent not only Republicans, but independents and a few Democrats that I've done in the past, as well as issues. And I think that it is a healthy forum to try and pull people who are open to voting outside of their party. The polling that we've done statewide says that Oregonians actually have crossed out of their party to vote for other people many, many times, and most often it's because of an issue. And so if you can utilize the platform to really reach beyond, this box you're stuck in, I think that's healthy.
I'm going to ask one of the questions from the floor. For a political candidate's social media, i.e. Facebook or Twitter, would you suggest campaign staff, the candidate, or both to monitor and post content?
I believe it has to be both, and I really appreciate that so many of the campaigns now are taking pains to differentiate when it's somebody over the other. The reality is, as a candidate, especially a very busy one, you probably don't have time to monitor. You need staff to help monitor and make sure you can respond to things as they emerge. But it's far more authentic if the candidate themselves or the elected official themselves is the one who's in there. I think most people don't believe, though, when it's an elected official or a candidate. Mayor Sam Adams did 99% of his own tweeting. Nobody believed that, even when he would say that. But I think that was before people started labeling, Hillary Clinton uses the little H when it's her tweeting versus her staff, and that's helpful.
I mean, I agree. I think it's probably going to end up being both just because of schedules and that sort of thing. But people appreciate that authenticity and that transparency from actual candidates. So, I mean, I think there's a certain political front runner now. Most people don't doubt that he's representing himself on social media. And, some people think it's beneficial, other thinks it's racist and detrimental.
Lindsay, what do you think? What advice would you give people who want to try to, as we were talking about earlier, pressure the system? Should they be following and monitoring and posting things to the candidate or the staff?
Well, I think it just ends up being both. I would laugh and say it depends on how high maintenance your candidate is and how apt they are to learning social media. And if they don't get it, you just move on. But I think it's a little bit of both. I actually really appreciate the fact that now the Oregonian editors, they actively comment and engage with folks that are reading the stories and responding. So I think a little bit of both is healthy.
All right. Ed?
Edward Hershey, City Club member. A lot of people are bemoaning the polarization of political discourse in this country. I'm wondering if you think that social media and the internet, especially with the decline of influence of the print media, has accelerated that process of polarization, and will it only continue?
Well, there's certain theories that your Facebook feed is moderated. There's a certain algorithm that it tends to only show you things published by people you already agree with. And I think that we see that in Google searches as well. So it's easy to fall into that particular trap. And that's why I always encourage people to engage with those of other belief systems and other value systems so you can get a comprehensive view of a particular issue. If people are not aware of this kind of process, then I think, yes, it can be detrimental. But as long as we stay conscious of it and find ways to engage with a very diverse community, then we can kind of buck that trend.
Would either of you like to answer that question?
I guess, I've only been on this planet for a handful of decades, but I tend to think we've always been polarized. I mean, this country in particular, a lot of individuals came together to make it, and that's not always a tidy little system. Social media, though, certainly has amplified it. I don't know that it's accelerated it. I think it's just made it louder and more noticeable, but I don't think that's a bad thing.
Wynn Wakala, City Club member. I've had the privilege of working part-time for elections office in 3 different counties since the 1970s. And I'm very proud that Oregon really has the best election system in the country. We are very good in how we do our elections here. I'm wondering if with all the Facebook and Twitter and everything else, people will feel like they already had their input and maybe not turn out to vote as much. How is it going to affect the voting, the social media?
The slacktivism effect that we were talking about earlier.
Yeah, I think it would be a huge mistake for any campaign to rely on social media as their primary campaign tool. I think if you're not, unless you start out polling incredibly well, and most people don't, but unless you're getting out there and actively engaging with people one-on-one, making sure they understand that you're educating them, this is when your ballot is going to show up, here is what you need to do, here is how you turn it in. It's, those things are not going to go away anytime soon, if ever.
That's not really what I meant. I meant, what about the individual people feeling like they've already put out there what they believe in just by doing it through media rather than working on campaigns or actually voting.
Right, and they may believe that, and it's our job to help them understand that that's not enough. So it's our job, whether it's knocking on their door or calling them to say, I'm glad you really like this candidate. Now fill out your ballot, please. It's due on May 17th.
Anybody else want to take a try at that one?
I think it's also important to recognize that for some people, not voting is a choice for them. Perhaps they're so disenfranchised by the system and see that they genuinely do not believe it's a system that represents or serves them, and so they might not vote. But it's important for us as community members to encourage them that their voice does matter, and that if they want to see long-term change, they have to overhaul the system by getting involved with it.
Yeah, social media may contribute to voters, not suppression, but lack of enthusiasm. But I don't know that there's any specific metrics behind that, any more so than, having a conversation around the coffee pot about something and then feeling like, my vote doesn't matter, why should I do this? I don't know that there's anything like that going on, but yeah, I would agree. It's only one tool in the toolbox.
Gil Johnson, City Club member. I noticed that while talking about Facebook and Twitter, you didn't mention chat roulette. I understand Donald Trump's big on that. Some people actually know what it is. I don't. Okay, my actual question is about alternatives to campaigns and election cycles. A lot of people actually believe in direct action, and we've seen it years ago at Occupy, last summer, saving the trees in Eastmoreland. Anybody know what the shed is? Okay. Over 2,000 people there? Okay, how do you get people to turn out for these things if you don't have social media? Or how have you used social media for rallies and other kinds of things like that?
Can I follow up on that really quickly? Facebook itself, what is Facebook's agenda? As I was looking into that, they have their own political action committee, and fomenting revolution is on their list of things that they do. Fascinated me. Okay.
Well, I think as Lindsay mentioned, this is just one tool out of many tools to drive change. And we do know that the Occupy movement was fueled a lot by Twitter. We've seen revolutions in Egypt and in the Middle East using Twitter. QQ in China has completely changed that media landscape as well. So I think it's a fascinating tool, and it's certainly one that's able to mobilize people fairly quickly. I mean, I think, Dave Chappelle's coming, tickets sold because of Facebook, right? So, a lot of stuff can happen in the real world. It's not an either-or situation, but we can certainly use it to bring more attention to things. And I think with the Black Lives Matter movement, with a lot of the other things that are happening in our communities, this is a way to reach new audiences and bring up issues that they might not be familiar with or otherwise have seen.
Do you ever use Facebook to get people out to an event? Do you ever use it for that way? I was asking. Okay.
We try, yes. I have used it in the context of just getting people motivated to show up at session and testify on bills. The minimum wage argument was a good example of that, trying to stir small business owners and others who were interested in the minimum wage argument to come down and testify and engage with your government. So yes, we have done that many times. But I think it's fascinating to me too to learn that, like in Seattle, they're running city council races completely on digital media. There is no print media. There is no, massive door-to-door GOTV effort. Some of these candidates are winning solely based on digital media, which I think is fascinating, and that's probably the direction we're going. But that's also very disrupted to the old model as well. So. We're just kind of along for the ride.
All right, I'm going to read a question from the floor. How do you use social media as listening strategy? How should organizations and elected officials do that? A listening strategy. Do you hear the roar of the people on the Facebook?
That's actually how I primarily use Twitter these days. I don't tweet very often anymore, but I do find Twitter to be, especially when things are sort of happening up to the minute, it's a great place to go and see. Simon mentioned the Black Lives Matter movement. I tracked protests happening in real time in Ferguson in a way that I wasn't going to be able to find anywhere else but on Twitter. And Facebook, I think, is a little bit more difficult to do that because you have cultivated a very specific and more social network there. But I think Twitter has become the sort of microcosm of news that's just fascinating to track an issue and opinions and real-time happenings.
The answer is yes. I do use it as a listening tool. There are select people on my list who don't necessarily fall into the conservative political camp that I check regularly. Some of you are in this room. And it really serves as just kind of a, you know, like you said, a listening check. It's something to, it's a tool to use that helps raise awareness and just sort of gauge where people are at, maybe where the public's at on certain issues. So, powerful tool.
I mean, I agree. I use it as the same kind of thing. You know, traditionally, marketers aren't just people who send information out, but they're also receivers of it. And I think with this particular tool, it's even better now.
All right. One last question from the floor.
Chris Andre, the City Club member. Thank you so much for holding this forum. It is incredibly revelatory. I learned a lot today. My question is, just as with the enormous gap between the very wealthy and the very poor, there are people who are cut out of the digital conversation because either, one, they just don't have it. It's too difficult to get to a library to access a means of participating, or they are working 3 jobs at different fast food places, and they're making hamburgers all day. And they accidentally put a hamburger in their laptop and sold it to somebody. So what's the, how do you take into account the enormous numbers of people who are left out?
Thank you. We only have 2 minutes left, so that's really a brilliant question. What about the people that can't even be there?
That's not a social media issue, though. There is definitely a digital divide, but keep in mind that so many of the issues being worked on right now, you know, whether it be minimum wage or some of the things being discussed in the presidential campaign, impact people who have the least amount of time to participate in the public discourse. I think that's something that we all need to keep in mind, no matter what tool or channel we're using.
Yeah, and I think I agree. It's not necessarily a social media issue. It's a technology issue. It's a community-driven issue. This is why it's so important to support things like your library and community forums like this so that people can have accessibility. But all around the world, we actually see low-income communities tend to use mobile and social media more than anyone else. So if the government and if our communities decide to support that here so that rural areas and people who don't have access can have access to this information, then I think we'll be all better off as citizens for that.
We're running out of time, so I was going to ask a quick final question. When I read this report, I'll say it again, Zach, it freaked me out. It was like everything I worried about with liberalism and social media and the whole nine. Do you worry that maybe we're heading towards an idiocracy with social media? I have to ask that. Do you know this term, idiocracy? What do you think? Can we control it? Can we keep that from happening? Final words.
No, I don't really see it as that. I think it's technology. Technology is changing so quickly. This is part of it. It's a small part of it. But, you know, we're seeing amazing things happen in education in some of our different states. You know, the charter school movement, some of the minority communities that are coming together, and some of these schools are being taught solely on computers. And it is the way of the future. It's not going away. And I think, you know, this is just one tool, it's one avenue to discover really what's going on, how our country is shifting. And I think it's, you know, it's changed from sitting down at 6 o'clock at night with your family and watching the tube to this. And so...
Oh, I guess we have to hurry up. Hurry up.
I mean, these are platforms for sharing information. I think what it might be doing is making people know a little about a lot of different things, as opposed to really focusing in on 1 or 2 issues that they care about and going in depth. And then we got to deepen that conversation.
I agree. I mean, it's a tool. Use it for good or evil. But if you really want to use social media well, treat it less like a megaphone, treat it more like the world's biggest telephone. So get involved with your communities.
Thank you.
Okay. We are... We are out of time. We are out of broadcast time for further questions. This is KAROL COLLYMORE, Board Governor of City Club. Please join me in thanking our guests, as well as Rebecca Tweed of the Friday Forum Committee, who produced today's program. We are adjourned.